The creek knew things before anyone thought to ask it. That's what Elsa Vance's grandmother used to say, standing on the dock in the pale gray of an Alaska morning, watching the creek mouth the way other people watched the horizon. She said the creek kept its own account of what was happening in the water, and if you paid close enough attention, it would tell you what was coming before anything else did. Not in any way you could explain to a person who hadn't spent years listening, just in the way certain things arrived or didn't arrive at the times they always had. Elsa was 64 years old. She had been listening for 30 years. Her grandmother, Vera Vance, had arrived in Alaska from the Pacific Northwest in 1947 with her husband and 2 small children and not much else. Her husband had died the following winter, not dramatically, not in any way that made a good story, but quietly, of the kind of illness that traveled fast in remote places with limited medical access. And Vera had stayed anyway, because the community needed what she could provide, and because she had looked at the harbor and decided it was worth staying near. She had built the fuel dock herself, or near enough, directed the construction, handled the money, kept the accounts, and had run it until her son was old enough to take it over. She ran the fuel dock and supply operation at the small boat harbor at the end of the road in a remote Alaska fishing community. The same operation her father had run before her and his mother before him, in a building that had been rebuilt twice since her grandmother first put up the original walls in 1948. The building leaned slightly to the north now, the way wooden things leaned in Alaska after enough winters, and Elsa had never straightened it because her grandmother had built that lean into the foundation on purpose, to account for the prevailing wind. Some decisions didn't need revisiting. She kept records the way her father had and his mother before him. Fuel transactions, boat arrivals and departures, catch weights logged at the dock, weather observations, and bait notes. Every season, since 1948, Vance had recorded the timing and abundance of small forage fish that gathered near the creek mouth each spring and early summer, the herring-like species that came into the warming shallows to feed and stage, and, in doing so, provided the local fleet with a close, reliable bait source that kept their operating costs manageable and their range practical. The bait notes were 3 generations of the same careful accounting. When the fish arrived, in what numbers, how long they stayed, where exactly in the creek mouth they concentrated. Her grandmother had started those notes because she supplied bait to the fleet herself in the early years and needed to know when to have it ready. Her father had continued them because he'd noticed the fish were a reliable environmental indicator, that seasons when the bait fish showed early tended to be good seasons for fleet, and seasons when they showed late or thin were worth watching. Elsa had continued them because the habit was there, and because the fleet still depended on the fish, and because breaking a 70-year record seemed like a strange thing to do. The fish arrived in early May for as long as the records went back. Not precisely the same date every year. The water temperature varied, the spring weather varied, but within a consistent window, usually the first 2 weeks of May, reliably enough that the fleet had planned around it for 3 generations. In the spring of Elsa's 59th year, the fish didn't come the first week of May, or the second. She noted in the bait log with a question mark and kept watching the creek mouth the way she always watched it, from the dock while she was fueling boats or from the window of the supply room while she was pulling orders. She knew what the bait fish looked like when they were present. A particular disturbance at the surface in the shallows, a quality of movement near the creek mouth that you learn to read after enough years of looking. It wasn't there. By the 3rd week of May, 2 boats that had been waiting for local bait had given up and run 60 miles south to pick up bait from a tender. Their fuel costs for that trip alone exceeded what a full season of local bait access would have cost them. Elsa watched them leave from the dock, heard the engines fade, and stood there for a few minutes before going back inside. She didn't know yet whether this was a problem or an anomaly. She had learned from her father to hold that distinction carefully. Problems required responses. Anomalies required watching. You had to know which one you were dealing with before you did anything at all. She wrote it down. The fish arrived in June. Late, thin. They stayed for 3 weeks instead of the usual 6 or 8. She noted the duration, the estimated density, the locations where the fish concentrated, which were different from the previous years, more scattered, less focused on the usual shallow coves near the creek mouth. She compared her notes to her father's, then to her grandmother's. Nothing in 70 years of records showed anything like this. She thought about what had changed, and that eventually led her to construction. The Alaska Commercial Development Authority had approved a large-scale fish processing and cold storage facility the previous autumn, funded through a state economic development package designed to strengthen the local fleet's economic position. The processing facility would give the community an onshore option for their catch rather than depending entirely on seasonal tender vessels, which was genuinely useful and genuinely needed. The project had broad local support, including from Elsa herself, who had submitted a comment supporting the economic rationale. The facility was built on and around the lower reach of the creek, its foundation requiring extensive grading and the filling of a section of the tidal marsh that had previously flooded and drained freely with each tide. The creek mouth itself had been left open. The facilities permitting had protected the actual channel, but the shallow tidal coves and mudflat areas that had flanked the creek mouth on both sides were gone, replaced by armored fill and the facility's concrete pad. Elsa hadn't made the connection immediately. She'd been watching the bait fish from the dock, writing down what she saw, and thinking about water temperature and regional abundance and all the other variables that could cause a forage fish run to arrive late or thin. The late spring had been genuinely cold that year. Maybe that was it. But the following spring, the fish were late again, and thin again, and this time the cold spring theory didn't hold. It had been a warmer than average April, the kind of early spring that usually brought the bait fish in ahead of schedule. She pulled out her grandmother's bait notes from the 1940s and 1950s and read them carefully for the first time in years. She had read them before. She had read everything before more than once, but she read them differently now, with a specific question rather than general familiarity. Her grandmother had described the fish in detail, not just timing and quantity, but behavior. The fish came into the warming shallows. That phrase appeared again and again in the earliest records, in the handwriting that was slightly formal in a way that people wrote when English was their second or third working language, careful and deliberate, leaving out nothing that seemed worth noting even when the significance wasn't immediately clear. The warming shallows. The shallow coves that warmed quickly in spring, that created the temperature differential the fish were looking for. The shallow coves that were now under 8 feet of fill and concrete. She submitted a comment to the Development Authority's annual facility review, which was a standard process for new infrastructure, noting the 2-season change in bait fish timing and location, her hypothesis about the thermal function of the lost shallow coves, and her family's 70-year bait record as a baseline. She kept the comment factual and brief, the way her father had taught her to communicate official concerns. No drama, no emotion, just the observation and what it might mean. The Development Authority's environmental consultant, a thorough man named Dr. Sable, responded that forage fish aggregation behavior was driven primarily by regional abundance trends, water temperature at the regional scale, and prey availability, factors that operated at a scale well beyond the creek mouth. He said the species in question were not habitat-specific at this life stage and could aggregate in any suitable shallow water area. He said the loss of the specific coves, while a change in the physical environment, was unlikely to represent a limiting factor for a species with broader habitat flexibility. He was not wrong about the species' general habitat flexibility. He was wrong about this particular aggregation and what it had been using those specific coves for. But Elsa didn't have proof of that yet. She had a hypothesis and 70 years of data showing something had changed, and a theory about why, and none of that added up to the kind of evidence that moved an institutional response. She thanked him for the response and filed it in the supply room with the rest of the permit correspondence. She sat at the desk for a while and looked at the creek mouth through the window. The problem with Dr. Sable's answer was that it wasn't wrong. Exactly. Forage fish were habitat flexible. The species did aggregate in a range of shallow environments. The regional abundance data was relevant. He had answered the question correctly for a species in general. He had not answered it for these fish in this creek, in this community. But she couldn't prove that yet. She had a pattern and a theory and 70 years of records, and none of that was sufficient to move an institution that had made its assessment and moved on. She went back to the dock and kept watching. The third season of the change brought something new. The fleet began adapting in ways that showed up in her fuel records. The boats that had always bought bait locally were now making 2-day bait runs south, burning significant fuel each time. She logged their departure times and fuel purchases and could calculate, without much effort, what the additional operating costs looked like per vessel per season. It wasn't trivial. For the smaller boats, the ones running on margins that didn't leave much room, it was a difference between a season that worked and one that didn't. One of those smaller boats was owned by a young fisherman named Calloway who had started the operation 3 years ago with a loan he was still servicing. He came in one afternoon to fuel up and mentioned, without particular complaint, that he'd almost decided not to make this season's run at all after pricing out the bait logistics. He'd done the math 5 different ways and kept coming out at a number that made the summer work only if everything else went well. Elsa wrote it in the bait log, not because it was data in any traditional sense, but because her grandmother had always included notes about what the fleet was saying alongside the bait observations. Fleet intelligence. Vera had called it in the earliest records, in that careful handwriting. The fish tell you what's happening in the water. The boats tell you what's happening in the community. Elsa had always thought of this as a charming habit, a human complement to the environmental data. Now, she understood it was part of the same accounting. She thought about that phrase for a while. Then she thought about something else her grandmother had written, not in the bait notes, but in a separate section of the earliest journal, a notation from 1952 about a private dock that had been constructed in one of the shallow coves. Temporary. The owner had said, just for the season. Her grandmother had written, bait fish left the South Cove this summer. Did not return until the dock came out in September. The cove warms in May. That's what they want. Not the cove itself, the warmth in it. When the dock blocked the sun, the warmth went with it. She had read that entry before. She had filed it under interesting. She had not connected it to anything. Not until now. The warming place. Her grandmother had understood the mechanism 40 years before Elsa needed to apply it. The fish didn't need those specific coves for cover or food. They needed the thermal condition those coves created. The rapid spring warming that happened in shallow, sun-exposed, protected water. When the dock blocked the sun, the warmth went with it. When the fill covered the coves, the warmth had nowhere to form. She called a fisheries researcher she'd met the previous year at a coastal community symposium, a careful woman named Dr. Ingrid Mavies who worked on forage fish ecology with a university in Juneau. She described what she'd observed over 3 seasons and shared the relevant pages of her grandmother's records, photographed and sent by email. Dr. Mavies called back 4 days later and said she thought the hypothesis was sound. She said the thermal microhabitat function of shallow tidal coves was real and well documented in the scientific literature for several forage fish species. It just wasn't routinely assessed in coastal infrastructure development reviews because it fell between jurisdictional categories. Not fish habitat in the conventional sense. Not wetland in the conventional sense. A thermal feature rather than a structural one. She said she'd like to test it. They spent the following spring together. Elsa on the dock, Dr. Mavies in the water with temperature probes, and a small boat measuring thermal conditions of the former cove locations versus the remaining natural shallows several hundred yards from the facility. Some mornings, Elsa brought coffee to the dock edge and watched Dr. Mavies working the probe in the cold water of the former cove sites, taking readings that were just air and concrete and the memory of what had been there. The data came in across April and May, patient and accumulating. And by the time the bait fish were due, Dr. Mavies had a clear picture of what was no longer there. The coves had warmed by as much as 8 degrees more than the adjacent deeper water in the spring thermal cycle. The concrete pad and fill that replaced them absorbed heat differently, did not release it into the water in the same way, and the facility's shadow extended over the nearest remaining shallows during the critical morning warming hours. The thermal differential that had drawn the bait fish was gone, not reduced. Gone. The fish had found an alternative area, farther from the creek mouth, on the other side of the facility's footprint. A remnant section of shallows that had escaped construction and still warmed in spring, though less efficiently than the original coves and later in the season. That was why they still arrived. They were a flexible species, as Dr. Sable had correctly noted. They had simply found the next best thermal option, just late, thin, scattered, and a location that required the fleet to travel an extra 30 minutes each way on their bait runs. Dr. Mavies presented the findings to the Development Authority's annual review board in September. The data was clear. The mechanism was documented. The connection to the facility's construction was not a theory anymore. The Development Authority did not dispute the findings. To their credit, they commissioned an immediate engineering review of mitigation options. What emerged from that review over the following winter was a proposal to reconstruct thermal shallow habitat on the northern side of the facility's footprint, an engineered shallow area, graded and oriented to maximize spring solar exposure, connected to the tidal creek flow, designed to replicate the warming function of the original coves. It was not cheap. It was not guaranteed to work exactly as planned. Engineered habitat rarely performed identically to natural habitat that had evolved its function over time, but the Development Authority funded it. And the following spring, for the first time in 4 seasons, the bait fish arrived in the second week of May, not in the old locations. In the new one, tentative at first, thinner than the records from 30 years ago. But there, Calloway came in to fuel up the morning the fish arrived and mentioned it almost offhandedly. They're back. He said, the bait's in the new cove. I picked up my supply right here this morning, and then paid his bill and left without making anything of it, which was the right response. It wasn't a triumph. It was a correction. The Development Authority's formal review of the incident included a section on observational baseline data and its role in identifying the problem. Dr. Mavies' report cited Elsa's family records as the only documentation demonstrating what the bait fish aggregation had looked like in what timing and abundance before the facility was built. Without those records, the changes in 4 seasons would have had no established baseline to compare against. The report also cited Elsa's grandmother's 1952 notation about the temporary dock, the observation that the warming cove was what the fish wanted, not the cove itself, as an interpretive key that had connected the thermal mechanism to the bait behavior. That one entry, written in careful English by a woman documenting what the sea was telling her in a single summer in 1952, had made the difference between a plausible hypothesis and an understood one. Elsa read the report at the desk in the supply room, with the building leaning slightly north the way it always had, and the dock visible through the window, and the creek mouth beyond it. She thought about her grandmother building this place alone, with 2 children, keeping records that nobody ever asked for, writing down things that seemed worth noting even when there was no obvious reason to note them. She thought about her father continuing those records for 40 years, and herself for 30, all of them tracking the same small fish in the same creek mouth, because a habit had been started, and the starting of it had seemed like the right thing to do. She opened a current bait log. She wrote the date, the water temperature, the estimated abundance of the fish in the new cove, the timing of their arrival relative to previous seasons. Then she wrote one more line, the kind of notation her grandmother would have recognized. Fish in the new cove. Second week of May, like always used to be. They found the warm water. She closed the log and put it on the shelf beside her father's volumes, beside her grandmother's journals, beside 76 years of the same record. The shelf was crowded now. She'd have to add another one soon, the first time in 30 years that had been necessary. Her father would have found that satisfying, she thought. He had always said the records were the point, not what was in them. Keeping was the discipline. What you kept would tell you what you needed to know when the time came. The creek moved outside, running the way it always had, carrying its small account of what the water was doing and what it needed, telling its story in the only language it had, the patient, seasonal, accumulating language of arrival and absence, waiting for someone who knew enough to keep writing it down.